I walked into the room and was very startled by the sound. It came and went and I followed it with my ear pressed to the ground. When no one was inside, I heard it growing oh so loud. An animal untraceable or a ghostly floating crowd. But you'll see what I mean when I say time just takes its toll.
Tonight's event is a new one for WNBA. This is our first program featuring the genre of graphic novel or comic book, depending on your preference. The panelists are members of a creative community called the DC Conspiracy, founded in 2005, with over 50 members who embody the best of creative comic talents in the DC area and work that runs the gamut from witty and literary works to comics which incorporate action, the mystical, and just plain nonsense. Collectively, they work to expand comic readership and fraternity through anthologies, minis, and webcomics, among other. Let me begin our event by introducing tonight's moderator, Mike Rohde. Mike is co-author of the Comics Research Bibliography, editor of Exhibition and Media Reviews of the International Journal of Comic Art, and a contributing writer for Hogan's Alley. Rohde was named Best Comics Art Blogger for the City Paper for his Comics DC blog in 2008. He edited Harvey Peaker Conversations, a book of interviews for the University Press of Mississippi. He has written for the Comic Journal and was selected as an RFK Journalism Awards judge for the editorial cartoon division in 2009 and 2010. Rohde currently writes about comics for the City Paper and is a resident of Washington, D.C. With that, I hand the program over to Mike, who will introduce tonight's panel of authors.
Thank you. Immediately next to me is Carolyn Belefski, who does the webcomic Curls, and is one of the creators of several other comic books, Kid Roxy, Black Magic Tales, and the Legettes, some of which she'll have for sale tonight. She posts nightly to her blog, Sketch Before Sleep, which I think the easiest place to see is usually on Facebook. That's where I usually run across it. And her work has been published in USA Weekend Magazine, the Commonwealth Times, Virginia Living Magazine, Magic Bullet, which is a free tabloid newspaper that's just come out recently, CROQ Zine, and the Pulse on ComicCon.com. And she was a nominee for the Kim Yale Award for the Most Talented Newcomer for 2010. Right next to her, we have Molly Lawless, a Boston native who moved to the DC area in 2005. She's self-published mini comics as well as a compilation, Infandum ad Infinitum. You can tell my daughter's the one taking Latin, not I. She's currently working on a full-length graphic novel from McFarlane Publishing titled Hit by Pitch, which is actually a baseball graphic novel, although it's not exactly a novel, it's nonfiction. And she's an avid blogger and includes her family in what she posts daily. She also posts a comic strip about every other day.
Every day.
Every weekday, okay.
That's right.
And on her side is Matt Dembicki, whose works include the award-winning nature parable Mr. Big, which is about a turtle, the great white shark story Zoc, did I get that one right?
Shock.
Okay, which I think he has some copies with him tonight. And Brewmaster's Castle, which is about the DC brewer Christian Heurich and his mansion on DuPont Circle. The anthology that he put together, Trickster, Native American Tales, has been getting a lot of good reviews, including from Booklist, Publisher Weekly, and School Library Journal. And it's been nominated by the Young Adult Library Service Associations for the 2011 Great Graphic Novels for Teens. Matt also hosts comic book making workshop for kids in and around the DC area. So that's more than enough for me. We solicited some questions from the WNBA group. And so we'll just start with some of the overall questions. And one of them was, what is the age range of the audience for graphic novels? And the person went on to say, I'm curious because graphic novels seem to be popular with younger and older readers alike these days. And I wonder if any of you want to take that based on either your own reading or what people have said to you about your work. Carolyn.
The graphic novels that we create for Curls Studio are all ages.
I think a lot of the most popular graphic novels right now deal with zombies, like Walking Dead is very popular. So obviously that might be a more adult audience than young children.
Yeah, I would agree that there seems to be something for everyone in this genre, and just the genre is just so accessible. Like a kid is more likely to pick up a book with pictures than one without pictures. So there is that accessibility, and I guess with that comes some responsibility sometimes, but it depends on who you're right for.
Your graphic biography is actually about an accidental manslaughter, though. Are you aiming this for children?
It's, as I'm writing it, I do have that in mind, that it's a story I became interested in when I was a kid. So with that in mind, I try to keep the language so that it's readable by someone who's younger, but it's not necessarily geared towards someone who is of a certain age. Kind of for anyone, but good question.
Let's go to Matt. Matt, your most recent work is actually a house biography, I guess we could say.
Yeah.
I don't think that was really aimed necessarily for a young audience. It was probably aimed for people about outrage.
Yeah, I think when I approach my books or my stories, I kind of really write about topics that interest me. And then it just kind of goes from there. Typically, I write more about kind of more adult-oriented stuff. The Brewmaster's Castle is actually a story that I did with a colleague of mine, Andrew Cohen, about the mansion on DuPont Circle. And I guess what kind of interested us about it was the fact that it was had a beer connection. So that kind of like drove the story. Versus, Trickster, where that's kind of more geared toward kids, even though there's some cultural aspects of that kind of appeal to adults. But in terms of the way comics are written, it's true, you have a variety. I think historically comics have been written for kids as a form of entertainment. And then somewhere probably around the 80s, 90s, I thought you saw surges of comics that kind of dealt with more adult topics. Mouse became very popular. Joe Sacco's illustrations of war-torn areas became very popular, kind of comic journalism. And I think actually recently you're kind of seeing a tide to go back toward writing comics for kids.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. Comics for adults probably started, and we use the term adults really loosely, in the 1960s with underground comics, where underground essentially meant sex and drugs and occasionally violence. And when those people grew up, they moved on to more adult subjects like Mouse, which is Art Spiegelman's story of his parents' experience in the Holocaust. Since then, we've seen, I think, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel is a story about growing up gay in a funeral home and dealing with your father's sexuality at the same time. And that was a Time Magazine Book of the Year. More recently, there's been a little bit of everything for everybody, I think. And even when it wasn't, when they were nominally for kids, Peanuts is not really a children's comic strip in many ways. So we'll move on to the next question, and if anybody wants to pursue any of these, feel free to stick your hand up at any time too. Okay, somebody does want to pursue.
Sorry, I was just wondering if there had ever been a comic book or a graphic novel included in a national reading list, or if it hasn't been, do you think we're close to that?
Okay, the question was a comic book included in a national reading list. It depends on what you mean by national reading lists.
For public schools, for example.
Oh yeah, Mouse is in public schools all the time. I can't get away from it, and I actually think they assign it to children that are too young for it. Persepolis, which is Marjan Satrapi's story of growing up during the Iranian Revolution, is usually one of those books that's selected when the entire community reads a book. I think that's been 4 or 5 times now. So yeah, there are definitely graphic novels that are sneaking into the school curriculum, but anybody? Okay, Carolyn's got one there.
Also, Jeff Smith's Bone. I'm pretty sure that it's probably on a lot of library lists and reading lists.
Right.
And that's definitely for children in all ages.
Yeah, why don't you define Bone for the part of the audience that doesn't read comics?
Bone is about this little white fellow who hangs out with two of his cousins, and they get into a lot of mischief, and it's this epic adventure, and it's a huge book. It's about this thick. A whole life work from Joe Smith, and I highly recommend it.
I think schools tend to gravitate toward comics that have some kind of cultural, historical aspect to them. And given that said, I can't recall anything off the top of my head, but also some social aspects. When Blankets came out by Craig Thompson, that was very popular. It's kind of one of those growing up comics. Recently, there's been a couple more. I can't recall. Stitches.
Stitches is by a children's book illustrator who told the story of having cancer as a child. Part of the problem is there's actually a parallel universe of comic books for school that nobody ever sees. They're published by the presses like Candlewick or stuff like that, and they never appear anywhere else. So there's actually tons of them out there. Some stuff that wanders back and forth. Andrew Halford did a couple of biographies of black activists, I think, in the 1960s. Recently, actually one of them was a biography of Ronald Reagan, about as far from black activists as you can get. And I think those tend to end up on reading lists as well. But they're not flashy, so most of us never hear about them. We tend to hear about the Chris Ware or the challenges from a library, which happen every once in a while as well. Okay. So let's go on to the second question, which is another fairly general one, which is about how the images are created. The question asked said, an author considered a computer and write a manuscript, but do graphic novelists create the storyboard and then draw by hand? Do they use computer programs? Do they draw and then scan it and send it to a publisher? And I will just start by saying that is as varied as anybody who decides to do any type of artistic creation. And we'll start with Matt now because he's on the far end.
Well, I typically come up with the idea and then my style is a little bit different. Actually, what I'll do is thumbnail sketches first, which is kind of like rough draft, as I kind of visually see the story and how I lay the story out. And when I do the thumbnails, I kind of work from there. I kind of let the story kind of flow, and then I'll go back and I'll kind of do the script for the story. When I collaborate with other people, though, I just kind of write a straight script. Usually let the artists kind of do their own thumbnails or layouts.